Welcome to the deep dive. We are jumping right into the thick of it today, and I just want to say we are really glad you are here with us in the room for this one.
Absolutely. It is great to have you sitting in with us.
The mission today is to look at a fundamentally fascinating aspect of human neurobiology, one that well, it gets right to the core of how you and I actually experience our own internal realities.
It really does. It's about the literal architecture of thought,
Right. We are pulling apart an excerpt from the research text called Neural Pathways of the Aphantasic Mind.
which is just a brilliant piece of work.
It is. We're looking at the hidden internal wiring of the brain, specifically how our minds attempt to conjure up visual images, and what happens when the physical wiring in the brain simply prevents that image from forming.
Yeah, that's the real mystery here.
We are looking at aphantasia, but more importantly, we're looking at how science has finally mapped the physical disconnect responsible for it.
The material we are looking at today represents a massive paradigm shift. I mean, for over a century, the nature of human imagination was basically relegated to philosophy.
Or just, highly subjective psychological surveys.
Exactly. It was the classic problem of other minds. How can anyone possibly verify what you do or do not see when you close your eyes?
You just have to take their word for it.
Right. But what this research does is strip away the subjective reporting. It grounds the phenomenon in the objective, mappable physical reality of the human brain's structural connectivity.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Right.
Because the text immediately focuses on brain imaging studies.
It does.
It explicitly states that we need to look at the brain imaging data showing these connections. Now, for someone who follows neuroscience, the shift from questionnaires to neuroimaging is, it's pretty familiar.
Sure, it's the standard progression.
But the application here to something as elusive as the mind's eye, it feels like a major leap. What are we actually looking at when we talk about imaging these specific connections?
What's fascinating here is the distinction between functional imaging and structural imaging. Both are critical to the findings in neural pathways of the aphantasic mind.
Okay, so functional versus structural.
Yeah. Historically, a lot of cognitive research relied on fMRI. That's functional magnetic resonance imaging.
Which measures the BOLD signal, right?
Exactly, the blood oxygen level dependent signal. That shows us which areas of the brain are consuming more oxygen and therefore which areas are active during a specific task.
Like watching a specific region light up on a screen.
Right. But the text isn't just talking about which regions light up. It is talking about the physical connections between them.
The actual roads.
The roads, yes. And that requires looking at white matter tracks.
So we are moving beyond just saying this region is active to actually mapping the biological cables connecting the regions. How does the imaging technology even accomplish that?
Researchers use a technique called diffusion tensor imaging, DTI.
DTI.
Okay. It's a specialized type of MRI that tracks the diffusion of water molecules in the brain.
Wait, it tracks water.
Yeah. In the cerebral cortex, the gray matter, water diffuses relatively randomly.
Yeah.
But in the white matter tracks, which are basically the bundled axons of neurons, the water molecules are constrained.
Because they're stuck inside the bundles.
Exactly. They have to move along the length of the nerve fibers, much like water flowing through a pipe.
That is incredible.
By measuring the directionality of that water movement, DTI allows neuroscientists to map the physical, microscopic pathways that link different cortical regions.
So when the text refers to mapping the architecture, it means tracing these highly specific myelinated axon bundles.
Precisely. We are acting as literal cartographers of the brain.
That makes the concept of a neural map deeply literal. I want you, the listener, to just imagine your own brain right now as a vast, interconnected map of highways. We aren't dealing with a conceptual flowchart here. We are looking at biological infrastructure.
Real physical roads.
And the text points to two very specific destinations on this map that have to be connected for visualization to occur. Point A is referred to as the cognitive control regions.
Right.
And point B is the visual and memory regions. I want to start with the cognitive control regions. The text positions this as the origin point. What exactly constitutes this control region when you're trying to imagine something?
The primary area we are looking at when the text mentions cognitive control is the prefrontal cortex, and more broadly, the frontoparietal control network.
So the very front of the brain.
Yes, the prefrontal cortex is the evolutionary seat of executive function. It is the steering wheel, essentially.
And the command center.
Exactly. It's responsible for working memory, goal-directed behavior, planning. When you set an intention, For example, if you decide right now, I'm going to visualize the house I grew up in, that conscious, voluntary initiation originates right there in the prefrontal
It
cortex.
formulates the query.
It does. It writes the algorithm for what the brain needs to retrieve and assemble.
But the prefrontal cortex doesn't hold the visual data itself, does it? It just issues the command.
No, it's highly abstract. It deals in concepts, rules, intentions, not in raw sensory representation.
So it's just the boss sending an email.
Exactly. To actually generate the subjective experience of an image, that cognitive command has to be routed to regions that process visual information and store visual memories.
Which leads us to the second destination the text identifies, point B, the visual and memory regions. I mean, I know the visual cortex is located at the back of the brain in the occipital lobe, but how does memory factor into this physical rendering? Like, where is the brain pulling the reference material from to build the image the prefrontal cortex is asking for?
It requires a highly coordinated network involving both the occipital lobe and the temporal lobes.
Okay.
The occipital lobe houses the primary visual cortex, known as V1. It also has extracestrate visual areas that process specific features, things like color, motion, shape.
Like a projector screen.
Right. But to visualize something from the past, you need the medial temporal lobe, particularly the hippocampus, which is deeply involved in episodic memory.
The hard drive.
Yes, the hard drive. When a visual memory is recalled, the hippocampus helps retrieve the stored information, and then the visual cortex is recruited to essentially represent that information.
Represent it. That's a great way to say it.
The visual regions are forced to activate in a pattern very similar to how they would if your eyes were actually perceiving the object in real time.
Now, the text keeps using this phrase, top-down neural highway, to describe the connection between the cognitive control regions and these visual and memory regions. Top-down as opposed to what? What makes a neurological process top-down?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the distinction between top-down and bottom-up processing is basically the fundamental dividing line between perception and imagination.
Okay, break that down for us.
Bottom-up processing is sensory-driven, so photons hit your retina. The optic nerve carries the signal to the lateral geniculate nucleus in the thalamus, and from there it goes to the primary visual cortex at the back of the brain. The physical environment dictates the neural firing.
So the signal is moving from the basic sensory receptors up into the higher cognitive areas.
Yes. You see a shape, your brain processes the edges, then the color, and finally your higher cognitive regions identify it as, say, a car.
So the outside world is forcing its way into the brain,
Garcia.
pushing data upward through the sensory hierarchy.
Exactly. The input dictates the experience, but the text is focusing on the precise inverse of that process.
The top-down highway.
Yes, deliberate visualization is a top-down process. There is no external sensory input. You are sitting in a dark room with your eyes closed. This sequence has to run in reverse.
So it starts at the top.
The higher-order cognitive regions, the prefrontal cortex at the top of the hierarchy, must generate a signal based purely on internal intention and project that signal down the highway into the primary sensory regions.
The prefrontal cortex literally forces the visual cortex to fire.
It is essentially the brain simulating a perception without the physical stimulus.
And to achieve that simulation, to send that complex command backwards down the sensory chain, it requires a dedicated physical pathway.
Yes. It relies on massive white matter tracts that stretch across the brain's geography. We are talking about structures like the inferior fronto-occipital fasciculus.
That is a mouthful.
It is, but it physically connects the frontal lobe to the occipital and temporal lobes. These are long-range, heavily myelinated axons.
Myelin is the insulation, right?
Right. It's the lipid layer that insulates nerves and increases the speed and efficiency of electrical transmission. For a top-down command to successfully initiate a complex, high-resolution visual rendering in the occipital lobe, the structural integrity of these long-range connections must be incredibly robust.
Here's where it gets really interesting. We've established the origin in the prefrontal cortex, the destination in the visual and memory regions, and the physical white matter highway connecting them.
Right, the map is laid out.
The source text brings us to the central revelation regarding aphantasia. It states that the condition likely stems from weaker connections along this specific top-down neural highway.
This is the crucial finding.
So it isn't a failure of the prefrontal cortex to form the intention. The steering wheel works fine, and it isn't a deficit in the visual cortex's ability to process imagery. The projector screen works. It's the road between them.
It's a failure of transmission.
What physically constitutes a weaker connection in the context of white matter tracks? Like, is the road just full of potholes?
Kind of. When neuroimaging data from individuals with aphantasia is analyzed via DTI, researchers look at a metric called fractional anisotropy.
Fractional anisotropy.
Yes, this is a measure of the microstructural integrity of the white matter. A lower value indicates a weaker connection.
Okay, but physically, what does that mean?
It could mean several things. It could mean there is a lower density of axons in that specific tract, or it could mean the axons are thinner.
Or maybe the insulation is bad.
Exactly. The myelin sheath wrapping the axons might be less developed. Any of these microstructural differences would increase signal degradation.
So the signal essentially dissipates before it can reach the visual cortex with enough strength to trigger a rendering.
The electrical impulse originates in the cognitive control region. But because the biological insulation or the fiber density is insufficient, the bandwidth of the connection is constrained.
It just fizzles out.
The command to visualize simply cannot recruit enough neural activity in the visual cortex to cross the threshold into conscious awareness.
Wow.
The individual has the concept, they have the memory, but the top-down signal fails to cross the physiological bridge required to turn that concept into a subjective visual experience.
The text highlights one specific word that seems crucial to understanding the boundaries of this condition. It states that these weaker connections make deliberate visualization difficult or impossible.
Deliberate, yes.
Why is deliberate the operational word here? Why is that so important for us to grasp?
Because the word deliberate isolates the specific pathway that is failing. A deliberate action is by definition an action initiated by the executive control network.
The prefrontal cortex.
Right. It is a conscious, voluntary effort. By specifying that deliberate visualization is what fails, the text confirms that the structural deficit is localized to the top-down pathway.
Ah, I see.
Think about it. If the visual cortex itself were compromised, the individual would have severe perceptual blindness. They wouldn't be able to process bottom-up sensory data from their eyes.
But people with aphantasia have perfectly normal vision.
Exactly. The visual hardware works flawlessly when driven by the physical world. It only fails when the prefrontal cortex tries to drive it manually.
So the conscious effort is precisely what is being blocked by the weaker white matter tracks. The intention is there, but the anatomical pathway cannot support the top-down cognitive load.
That's it, exactly.
The text also notes that this makes visualization difficult or impossible, which clearly implies a gradient. It isn't a strict binary where you either have a perfect connection or a completely severed one, right?
Not at all. The spectrum of connection strength aligns perfectly with the subjective reporting of aphantasia. Structural integrity in biology is rarely absolute. It exists on a bell curve.
So what's on the other end of the curve?
At one end of the spectrum, you have individuals with hyperphantasia.
Hyperphantasia.
Yes. Their top-down white matter tracts are incredibly robust, highly myelinated, and dense. Their prefrontal cortex can send a signal so strong that their visual cortex generates an image almost indistinguishable from physical reality.
That sounds intense.
It is. And as you move down the spectrum, the microstructural integrity of those tracts decreases.
The signal degradation increases.
Right. In the middle of the spectrum, an individual might be able to conjure a vague, fleeting image. The deliberate command makes it across the highway, but the bandwidth is so low that the resulting visualization is low resolution.
Or maybe colorless. Or unstable.
Exactly. It's the difficult part of the text's phrasing.
And then, at the far end of the spectrum,
The white matter connectivity is so constrained that the top-down signal completely drops out. Zero activation occurs in the visual cortex in response to a cognitive command.
total aphantasia.
That is total aphantasia, the impossible end of the spectrum.
It is a phenomenal way to reframe how we think about internal experience. I mean, it removes any implication of psychological blockages or lack of cognitive effort.
Completely.
If you ask someone with total aphantasia to picture an apple, their prefrontal cortex works just as hard. It formulates the exact same top-down command as someone without the condition.
But the physical cables connecting their frontal and occipital lobes simply do not have the microstructural capacity to carry that specific type of traffic.
It forces us to acknowledge that our subjective realities are physically bound by our unique neuroanatomy. For decades, cognitive psychology operated under the assumption that the fundamental architecture of thought was uniform across the species.
We assumed everyone possessed a mind's eye because the vast majority of people do.
But this imaging data demonstrates that variations in white matter connectivity result in fundamentally different ways of processing information.
Yes. Individuals with aphantasia often develop profound cognitive workarounds. They rely heavily on semantic memory, spatial awareness, and conceptual logic to navigate tasks that others rely on visual imagery for.
The prefrontal cortex simply routes the problem-solving process through different, more robust neural pathways.
It's remarkably adaptable.
So what does this all mean for how we understand the brain as a whole? Let's recap for a second. We've walked through the physical evidence, looking at how diffusion tensor imaging maps the white matter tracks.
The DTI mapping.
Right. We've identified the prefrontal cortex as the origin point for cognitive control, and the occipital and temporal lobes as the visual and memory rendering engine.
The start and end points of the map.
We've established that deliberate visualization requires a top-down signal to travel across long-range neural highways, and that aphantasia is the direct result of weaker microstructural integrity along those specific paths.
The disconnect is literal, physical, and mappable.
It is a comprehensive structural explanation, but it immediately invites deeper inquiry. By isolating the failure to the deliberate top-down pathway, the text leaves a massive door open regarding non-deliberate neural activity.
This raises an important question. If aphantasia is caused by a disconnect on the top-down neural highway, making deliberate visualization impossible, what happens during non-deliberate, spontaneous visualization?
Because the brain is highly redundant. If the top-down highway is functionally blocked for deliberate commands, what happens when the visualization isn't deliberate?
Precisely the area that researchers are currently probing. Does the brain have alternative, hidden, bottom-up highways that bypass cognitive control entirely?
Allowing those with aphantasia to still experience visuals.
Yes. Many individuals with total aphantasia, people who cannot summon a single visual image on command, while awake, report having incredibly vivid, highly visual dreams.
That is wild.
If the structural connectivity between the cognitive control regions and the visual cortex is too weak to support imagery, how is the visual cortex rendering dreams?
That implies that dreams do not rely on the same top-down neural highway. The signal must be originating somewhere else.
Dreams are spontaneous. They are not initiated by the conscious, waking prefrontal cortex.
Because we're asleep, the boss is off the clock.
Right. In fact, during REM sleep, the executive control regions are largely deactivated. The visual imagery in dreams is likely driven by bottom-up or lateral pathways originating deep within the brainstem and the limbic system.
Pushing signals upward into the visual cortex.
Exactly. Because this spontaneous imagery bypasses the prefrontal top-down highway, it is entirely unaffected by the weaker connections responsible for aphantasia.
That is a staggering realization. The visual cortex of someone with aphantasia is fully capable of rendering high-definition internal imagery, and it actively does so every night.
The machinery works perfectly.
It is strictly the conscious access to that machinery that is blocked. The front door is locked due to a faulty pathway, but the back doors remain wide open.
Beautifully put.
What about trauma or PTSD? Does that utilize the same back doors?
The clinical data suggests it does. Intrusive flashbacks in PTSD are, by definition, non-deliberate.
They just happen to you.
They are hyper-aroused, spontaneous memory retrievals driven heavily by the amygdala, the brain's fear center.
And the amygdala isn't using the top-down highway.
No, the amygdala has its own dense, rapid connections to the visual and memory regions that bypass the prefrontal cortex's deliberate control.
Oh, wow.
Consequently, a person with aphantasia who experiences trauma can suffer from highly visual, intrusive flashbacks, even though they cannot voluntarily picture the face of a loved one.
The emotional salience of the memory forces it through an alternative neural route.
It bypasses the broken bridge entirely.
It fundamentally reshapes how we view the organization of the brain. It isn't just a single network that turns on or off. It is a massive, overlapping series of independent pathways.
It really is.
The fact that an individual can have a completely severed connection for deliberate thought while maintaining perfect connectivity for spontaneous, emotionally driven imagery is just incredible. The map of the brain is far more complex than just point A to point B.
The study of aphantasia, particularly through the lens of structural imaging, is ultimately teaching us about the absolute modularity of human consciousness.
Modularity, meaning we have distinct, separate tools.
Yes, the ability to voluntarily simulate reality is a highly specialized, biologically expensive function. It relies on some of the longest and most vulnerable white matter tracts in the nervous system.
And when those tracks are weaker?
The brain seamlessly shifts its processing strategies, proving that visualization is merely one tool in the cognitive toolkit, not the foundation of thought itself.
We set out today to look at the neural pathways of the aphantasic mind. And we ended up exploring the physical boundaries of human willpower and imagination.
It's been a fantastic journey.
The brain is a masterclass in adaptation, finding alternative routes when the main highways are washed out. Thank you for joining us in the room today. Keep questioning the hidden architecture of your own experiences and keep looking for those alternative pathways. We will see you on the next deep dive.